This is our second part of the lecture on the endocrine system in Biology 160, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology. In this part of the lecture, we're going to be looking at the pituitary gland and the different hormones that are produced in the pituitary gland and their function in the body. Before we do that, though, I'd like to take a minute and have you review some of the concepts that we talked about in the previous lecture, having to do with the differences comparing the endocrine system to the nervous system. So I have a slide here. What I want you to do is take a minute and stop this recording and see if you can write down the comparisons between the endocrine system and the nervous system. So some of the things we talked about last time. So go ahead and stop the recording and we'll see you here in just a minute. Okay, welcome back. So let's go over the differences between the endocrine system and the nervous system. So the first one I want to talk about is the speed at which these two systems work. So endocrine system, we consider this a slow system. The nervous system is a fast-acting system. So it's an electrical system, almost instantaneous. When you think about it, it's happening. So you're already moving your arm just as you're thinking about it. Endocrine system, on the other hand, so the hormones are sent out into the blood, so it's a little more slow-acting system in general, because it doesn't go directly to those parts of the body. This next thing is that the nervous system is a very specific and direct system. Specific might be a bad word. That might not be a good word to use for this, but direct means that, again, this idea that the neurons are going straight to those organs, whereas the endocrine system is I'll say an indirect system. And what that means is that if the hormones want to affect the different organs in the body, they don't go directly there like the neurons do. They have to go kind of a roundabout way as they travel through the blood in order to get to the part of the body that they're trying to trigger. So there's still very specific. It targets very specific cells, but it has to get there in a more indirect pathway, whereas the nervous system has neurons going straight from the central nervous system directly to that organ or to that tissue that it wants to signal or wants to trigger. And then the last difference is the length of how long that signal lasts. And the endocrine system is what we'd call long-lasting, and the nervous system, we'd say that's a short duration in how long it lasts. So the nervous system, as soon as you send that signal, it's gone. You have to continue sending signals in order to have that continue. Whereas the endocrine system, it's flowing through the blood. It'll continue. It has a more long-lasting effect on the organs and the tissues that it's affecting. So these are the main differences between these two systems. Again, these are both control systems in our body, but they work just a little bit differently, work together in order to have things happen. So let's talk about the pituitary gland. And so first of all, let's go and look at where it is. So here in this slide here, we're showing the major organs of the endocrine system. You can see the hypothalamus is up here next to the brain, part of the brain. And then directly below that, we have the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is about the size of a pea, and it's connected on almost like a little stalk on the hypothalamus. Comes down here and it's just sitting right below the hypothalamus there. And the pituitary gland is a very important organ. It's very small, but a very important organ. It's often been called the master endocrine gland, is what they've called in the past. But it does have an interesting relationship with the hypothalamus, even though the pituitary gland, in particular the anterior pituitary gland. So there are two parts of the pituitary gland. We have the anterior part of the pituitary gland. We have the posterior part of the pituitary gland. But specifically, the anterior pituitary gland produces hormones that are very, very important in their functioning and their control of the body. and so it's been called the master pituitary gland. But the hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary gland. And so even though it's been called the master endocrine gland, the anterior pituitary gland has been called the master endocrine gland, it is actually controlled by the hypothalamus, and so that's an interesting relationship there. And in the last lecture, I mentioned that the relationship between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland, when we were talking about the hormonal stimuli of stimulus of endocrine glands. And so the hypothalamus, it does produce two hormones, but those are stored in the posterior pituitary gland. But the way that it controls the anterior pituitary gland is also hormonal control. And so it sends these hormones down through a portal system, a blood system, down to the anterior pituitary gland, which then stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to release its hormones, which then go out and control the other, either other endocrine organs or the cells of the body, depending on the type of hormone that it is. This is a slide that shows the brain, the skull. So we're looking down on the skull. So this is as if you took a cross section of the skull, and we're looking down on the top of the skull here. You can see the frontal bone. So this is the front of the brain up here, and you can see the occipital bone here. This is the foramen magnum. That's where the spinal cord goes down, leaves the brain and goes down through the skull down in below. That kind of gives you an idea of what we're looking at here in this picture here. So again, looking down on the skull, you have the occipital bone here in the back, and there's this place called the sella turcica, and what that, if you translate that, that means the Turk's saddle. This is this little depression in the skull as a whole. Then that's where the pituitary gland sits, is right there. So it's surrounded, so it's this bony depression within the skull that is there to protect that the pituitary gland as it comes down off of the brain. And so that's where it's located inside the body. The anterior pituitary gland produces a number of hormones. There's 6 total, and 2 of these are going just out into the body. We say these are non-endocrine targets. They're just being released out into the blood. They're going to affect certain organs. And of the other 4 are what we call tropic hormones, meaning that they're leaving the anterior pituitary gland and they are going out to signal other endocrine organs and endocrine glands as opposed to certain cells. And it triggers those endocrine glands to further produce and secrete other hormones. And so that's 4 of those are doing that, and the other are non-endocrine targets. So we call the endocrine gland, we call those tropic hormones. So the 2 that are non-endocrine targets, they're the growth hormone, prolactin, and then the ones that are, we have thyroid stimulating hormone, and we abbreviate this as TSH. And what it does is, it's also called the thyrotropic hormone, and what it does is it stimulates the thyroid in order to release its hormones that it needs to control metabolism. Then we have the adrenocorticotropic hormone, and we abbreviate this ACTH. So you may see that abbreviation sometimes. And what it does is it goes down and it affects the adrenal gland, and in particular the adrenal cortex. And I'll look at another slide here in a second that'll show you that. And then we have 2 gonadotropic hormones. We have one that's called FSH and one that's called LH. You may have heard these before: follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And then growth hormone, we abbreviate that as GH, and prolactin, we abbreviate that as PRL. And those are the 6 hormones that are found, or that are produced by the anterior pituitary gland, released out into the body to control a number of things. And so we'll look at these a little bit more and about what they do and the organs that they target, that they signal. Some characteristics of the anterior pituitary hormones. First of all, they are all proteins, or all peptides, so they're amino acid based hormones, and what that means is that they're going to act through a second messenger system, so they can't directly go into the cell and signal the DNA, but they have to work through the receptor proteins on the outside of the cell and move in that way. And they're all regulated by hormonal stimuli. and it's mostly negative feedback mechanisms that are happening here. So the hormonal stimuli, what this means is the hypothalamus, again this connection here, so the hypothalamus is sending hormones down into the anterior pituitary gland, and that is going to control the hormones that are released. And here you can see the pituitary gland, and notice how it has two parts. We have the anterior pituitary over here in the red, and we have the posterior pituitary. Notice how the posterior is continuous with the hypothalamus. So it's made out of the same tissue. It's an actual outgrowing of the hypothalamus, whereas the anterior pituitary is made of a different type of tissue. It arose differently, and it produces its own hormones, whereas the posterior pituitary gland only stores hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus as they're released. But the hypothalamus produces hormones that affect the adrenal gland and cause it to release things like the growth hormone. And the growth hormone, its job is to go out and it affects the bones and muscles, cause them to grow. We have prolactin, and it affects the mammary glands and the production of milk. It is also produced in males, but we're not sure necessarily what that function is. Right now all we know is that it does affect milk, the release of milk. The two gonadotropic hormones, the FSH and LH, they're produced both in males and females. They have differing results in males and females, but they trigger the or target the testes and the ovaries, and cause and are functioning in the reproduction mechanisms of humans. The thyrotropic hormone stimulates the thyroid gland found in the throat area, dealing with metabolism. And then finally we have the adrenocorticotropic hormone. You see here ACTH, and the adrenal gland, remember that the adrenal gland is found, it sits right on top of the kidneys, and it actually has two parts. It has the adrenal cortex on the outside here, and then it also has the adrenal medulla, which is found on the inside. Both of these parts produce different hormones, but it's only the adrenal cortex that is affected by the anterior pituitary gland. So let's talk a little bit more about growth hormone. In general, it's a metabolic hormone. It affects the growth of skeletal muscles and long bones. And this is what determines the final body size. So how tall you're going to be, whether you're going to be tall, short, and some other things it does, though, it also causes amino acids to be built into proteins and causes fats to be broken down for energy as opposed to glucose. So that leaves the glucose in the blood to be used by the other cells as your body breaks down fat. So your growth hormone is released throughout your childhood, and it's going to affect your size. And there are some things that can go wrong with the growth hormone. First of all, we can have what's called pituitary dwarfism, and this is when you're going to end up being really short. So you're only going to be like 4 feet tall, or less than 4 feet tall. And this is when you don't produce enough growth hormone. We also have gigantism, and this is when you produce too much growth hormone. So you end up with people that are 8, 9 feet tall, very tall, their long bones very long, because this has happened for a long time. So pituitary dwarfism is caused by a hyposecretion, which means less. Gigantism is a hypersecretion, meaning more. So either too much or too little GH. We also have something called acromegaly, and this is another form of hypersecretion, meaning again too much GH being released. But in this case, it's when during the adult stage. So after the epiphyseal plates have already fused, they've ossified, they're no longer growing, and so what happens here is you have the growth hormone still being released, and so you have this growth, larger size, kind of this widening of the person as opposed to getting taller and taller. And often acromegaly is caused by a tumor in the pituitary gland. And so as this tumor is growing in the pituitary gland, the cells, they're still functioning as endocrine cells, but they're releasing all this pituitary hormone, all this growth hormone out into the cells. And so since the body can't grow any longer, it starts to grow wider, and because of this hypersecretion. One good example of somebody that had this is Andre the Giant. So he was a famous wrestler, and he had acromegaly. So he was pretty tall. He was taller than an average man, but he was also very, very, very large. And especially you see this in the face, the nose, the chin, the eyebrows. They're going to continue to grow over time. Another interesting thing about acromegaly is that this is often used. Well, this is one of the explanations that some people have for a Bible story, the David and Goliath Bible story that you're probably familiar with. So this is a story where you have David, the young man, the young shepherd that goes out and is able to use a slingshot to defeat the giant. And they think that some people's explanation is that maybe Goliath had acromegaly. So he had a tumor that was causing this growth hormone to continually be produced, and so he was this very large man. But an interesting thing about this tumor, though, is that as it grows, it can also affect peripheral vision, because as this tumor continues to expand, it can affect those optic nerves that are coming by. And so maybe Goliath didn't have any peripheral vision, and so this allowed David to come from the side and hit him with this slingshot and kill him because of that lack of peripheral vision due to this tumor. And this may or may not be the correct explanation, but it is an interesting thing to think about, and it is a good explanation about that Bible story and how acromegaly, so this tumor, can cause these changes in these men, and that allowed David to defeat Goliath in the fight there. The other hormones of the anterior pituitary gland, we have prolactin, we've already talked about, so stimulates milk production. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, we'll talk about the adrenal cortex later and what it does in the thyroid. And then there's the gonadotropic hormones that I want to focus on a little bit more. There's the follicle stimulating hormone, again produced both in men and women, but in women this is stimulating the follicle development in the menstrual cycle. So this is development of the egg as it's getting ready to be released in ovulation. Also stimulates sperm development in the testes. And then there's the luteinizing hormone, LH, and this triggers actual ovulation of the egg, but it also stimulates testosterone production in males. And so if you have hyposecretion of either of these hormones, either FSH or LH, that will lead to sterility. So you will no longer be fertile. And so these are very important hormones, both in males and females. Hypersecretion doesn't seem to have much of an effect, but if you're not producing enough, then that can be a problem. And we'll talk more about these hormones when we look at the reproductive system. Now let's look now at the posterior pituitary gland. And posterior pituitary gland sits right behind the anterior pituitary gland. There are two hormones that are released, but again, these hormones are not produced by the posterior pituitary gland. They're produced by the hypothalamus, and they're sent down to the pituitary gland, and that's where they're stored until they're released. Now, this is kind of interesting because these are produced in neurological cells, and they don't move down to posterior pituitary gland in blood vessels. They actually move down in nervous tissue through these axons. So they're produced in these cells up above here in the what we call neurosecretory cells, and then they move down the axons until they're stored in the pituitary, and we have what's called ADH and oxytocin, and those are the two that are stored there until they're released. Oxytocin you may have heard about before. This stimulates contraction in the uterus during labor. There are some synthetic hormones. One very often used one is called Pitocin, and these are used to speed up labor or even get labor to begin in females that are having a baby. And so you may be familiar with this if you've ever been involved in labor or if you've ever had a child or something like that. You've probably heard about oxytocin. Also is important in the ejection of milk in a nursing woman as well. So this has a couple of important functions. And the other one we have is antidiuretic hormone, ADH, and this one is a hormone that inhibits the urine production in kidneys. And the way it does that is it causes the kidneys to hold the water back. It doesn't release that water, and we'll see this more when we talk about the kidneys in this later in this course. But this is a posterior pituitary hormone that is produced, and another thing that it also does is it's also a vasoconstrictor, meaning that it causes blood vessels to constrict, and this can lead to an increase in blood pressure as well. And so that's another function that it has, and for that reason we call it vasopressin is another name for this hormone, ADH, because of that function in constricting of the vessels. And so ADH is an interesting hormone in these ways. And another interesting thing about ADH is that it is affected by alcohol use. So when people are drinking alcohol, what that does is that causes ADH to not be released. And so if you think about somebody that drinks a lot, they also go to the bathroom a lot. And the reason is because this ADH is not being released, and so all this urine is released, and they need to go to the bathroom. This is also causes what we know as the hangover the next morning. So one of the main causes of hangover is dehydration. The reason you have dehydration is because this this hormone was not being produced, and so it's an interesting connection there as well. So those are the hormones of the pituitary gland. In the next section we'll go on and look at another organ after this and continue moving through the endocrine system.